I'm Kira Levesque, and I will be reading The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out at sea, the water is as blue as the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest crystal. But it is very deep, deeper than anchor ever yet reached. Many church towers would have to be piled one upon the other to reach right up from the bottom to the surface. Down there live the sea folk. The most wondrous trees and plants grow there, and the stalks and leaves are so easily bent that they wave to and fro at the least motion of the water, just as if they were living beings. All the fishes, small and great, glide among the branches, just as the birds fly about the trees up here. In the deepest spot of all lies the Sea King's palace. The walls are of coral, and the tall pointed windows of the clearest amber, while the roof is of shells, which open and shut according to the tide, and lovely they look, for in every one of the shells lies a glistening pearl, any of which would be the glory of a queen's crown. The Sea King's wife had been dead for many years, so his old mother kept house for him. She was a wise woman and very proud. She always went about with 12 oysters on her tail, the other important folk being allowed to wear only 6. Yet she was very well thought of, especially because of the loving care she took of the little sea princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 pretty children, but the youngest was the loveliest of them all. Her skin was as delicately tinted as a rose leaf, and her eyes were as blue as the deepest sea. But, like all the others, she had no feet, her body ending in a fish's tail. All day they used to play in the great rooms of the palace, where living flowers grew upon the walls. When the large amber windows were opened, the fishes would swim through them, just as the swallows fly into our houses when we open the windows. Only the fishes swam right up to the little princesses, ate out of their hands, and let themselves be patted. Around the palace was a large garden full of bright red and dark blue trees. The fruit shone like gold, and the flowers like burning fire, as the stalks and leaves moved to and fro. The soil itself was the finest sand, but pure blue as sulphur flames. A wonderful blue tint lay over everything. One would think that one was high up in the air, with nothing but sky above and below rather than at the bottom of the sea. During a calm, too, one could catch a glimpse of the sun. It looked like a crimson flower, from whose cup light streamed out of. Each of the little princesses had her own garden plot where she could dig and plant as she pleased. One gave her flower pot the form of a whale, another wished hers to look like a little mermaid, but the youngest planted hers in a circle to look like the sun, and would only have flowers which shone red like it. She was a strange child, silent and thoughtful, and while her sisters delighted to make their gardens pretty with all the strangest things they could get from wrecked vessels, all that she would have, besides the rosy red flowers which looked like the sun, was a pretty statue of a handsome boy, cut out of pure white marble, which had sunk to the bottom of the sea during a shipwreck. She planted by the statue a rosy red weeping willow. It grew splendidly, and its fresh branches hung over the statue, nearly down to the sandy bottom, where the shadows took a violet tint and moved to and fro like the branches. It seemed as if the top of the tree were at play with its roots, each trying to snatch kisses. The little mermaid's greatest joy was to hear about the world of men above. She made her old grandmother tell her all she knew about ships and towns, people and animals. What she thought specially wonderful was that the flowers which grew upon the earth should give out sweet smells which they do not do at the bottom of the sea, and that the woods were green, and that the fishes among the branches could sing so loudly and beautifully that it was a joy to listen to them. It was the little birds that her grandmother called fishes. The little girls would not have understood her if she had called them birds. "When you are 15," said the grandmother, "you shall be allowed to swim up out of the sea and sit in the moonshine on the rocks and see the big ships sail by. You shall see woods and cities, too." In the following year, one of the sisters would be 15 years old, but how about the others? Each was a year younger than the one before, so the youngest would have to wait 5 whole years before it would be her turn to come up from the bottom of the sea and see what our world is like. But each promised to tell the others what she had seen and what she had thought the most remarkable on the first day, for their grandmother did not tell them half enough, and there were many things they wanted to know about. But none of them wished so much to go as the youngest, just the one who had the longest to wait and was so silent and thoughtful. Many a time she stood at the open window and looked up through the dark blue water where the fishes dashed about with their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars, of course. They shone quite faintly, but at the same time they looked twice as large as through the water as they looked to us. When something like a dark cloud glided across, she knew that it was either a whale swimming overhead or else a ship with many people on board, who certainly never dreamed that a pretty little mermaid stood below and stretched her white arms up toward the keel of their vessel. And now, the oldest princess was 15 years old and might rise to the surface of the sea. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to tell about, but the nicest of all, she said, was to lie in the moonshine on a sandbank in the calm sea, and to see close by the shore the large town where the lights were twinkling like hundreds of stars, to hear the music and the noise and bustle of carts and men, to look at the many church towers and spires, and to hear the bells ringing. It was just because she could not go ashore that she longed for all these things. Oh, how the youngest sister listened! And afterwards, when she stood in the evening at the open window and looked up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all its noise and bustle, and even fancied she heard the church bells ringing. The next year, the second sister had leave to mount up through the water and swim where she pleased. She rose just as the sun was going down, and she thought the sunset was the prettiest sight of all. The whole sky looked like gold, she said, and the beauty of the clouds was lovely. Red and violet, they had sailed right over her, but far quicker than they, a flock of wild swans had flown, like a long white veil, right over the place where the sun stood. She also swam towards the sun, but it sank, and the rosy gleam left behind was soon swallowed up by the sea and the clouds. A year after that, the third sister came up to the surface. She was the boldest of them all, so she swam up a broad river which ran into the sea. She saw pretty green hills covered with vines, castles and country houses peeping forth from lovely woods. She heard the birds singing, and the sun shone so that often she had to duck down under the water to cool her burning face. In a little creek she came upon a whole swarm of children. They were running about quite naked and splashing in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they ran away in terror, and a little black beast came up. It was a dog, but she had never seen a dog before. It barked so savagely at her that she was frightened and swam back to the open sea again. But never could she forget the lovely woods, the green hills, and the pretty children who could swim in the water, although they had no fish's tails. The fourth sister was not so bold. She stayed out in the middle of the sea and said that was nicest of all, for you could see for miles and miles around, and the sky above looked like a great glass bell. Ships she had seen too, but so far away they looked like seagulls. The merry dolphins had turned somersaults, and the great whales had squirted water up through their nostrils, so that it seemed as if hundreds of fountains were playing all around. And now came the turn of the fifth sister. Her birthday was in the winter, and she saw what the others had not seen the first time they went up. The sea had quite a green color, and round about floated huge icebergs. Each looked like a pearl, she said, and yet was far larger than the church towers which men had built. They had the strangest shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had placed herself on one of the largest, and all the vessels had hurried past in terror while she sat there and let the wind flutter her long streaming hair. But towards evening the sky became cloudy, it thundered and lightened, while the dark sea lifted the large icebergs high up so that they shone in the strong glare of the lightning. All the ships took in their sails. Everyone was afraid, but she sat calmly on her iceberg and watched the lightning as it zigzagged into the troubled sea. The first time each of the sisters rose to the surface of the water, she was delighted with the new and beautiful things she saw. But afterwards, when they were grown-up girls and could go above whenever they chose, they did not care enough to take the trouble. They liked the deep water better. Very often in the evenings, the 5 sisters would entwine their arms and rise in a row to the surface of the water. They had beautiful voices, sweeter than any of ours, and when a gale was blowing and they feared that a ship might be lost, they would swim before the vessel and sing sweetly of how happy it was at the bottom of the sea, and tell the sailors not to be afraid to come down. But the sailors could not understand their words. Now, when her sisters thus rose arm in arm through the sea, the little sister would stay below, alone, looking up after them, and she felt as if she must cry. But mermaids have no tears, and so they suffer all the more. "Oh, if I were 15, she said, "I know that I shall love the world above and the people who live there." And at last she was 15 years old. "Well now," said her grandmother, "come here and let me dress you like your sisters." And she placed a wreath of white lilies in her hair, but every petal was the half of a pearl, and the old lady told 8 large oysters to cling fast to the princess's train to show that she was a princess. "But they hurt me so," said the little mermaid. "Yes, but one must suffer a little for appearances," said the old lady. Oh, how gladly the little mermaid would have torn off all this finery and laid aside her wreath. The red flowers from her garden suited her much better, but she dared not to do it. "Goodbye," she said gladly, and rose light and bright as a bubble up to the surface of the water. The sun had just sunk as she raised her head above the sea, but the clouds were still pink and gold, and in the midst of the pale sky sparkled the evening star, so clear and lovely. The air was mild and cool, and the sea as still as a mirror. A large black ship with 3 masts lay upon it. Only a single sail was up, for not a breath of wind stirred, and the sailors were sprawling about on the masts and rigging. There was music and singing, and as the evening darkened, hundreds of gray-colored lamps were lit, looking as if the flags of all nations were waving in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin window, and every time the water lifted her, she would peep in through the panes, and could see many finely dressed people. The handsomest was the young prince with his large black eyes. He could not be more than 16 years old, and this was his birthday, and that was why they were having all this merriment. The sailors danced upon the deck, and when the young prince stepped up, more than 100 rockets rose into the air. They shone as bright as day, so that the little mermaid was frightened and dived down beneath the water. But she soon popped up her head again, and then it seemed as if all the stars of heaven were falling down upon her. Never had she seen such fireworks. Large suns spun round and round, throwing out sparks. Splendid fiery fishes danced about in the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea. On the ship itself, it was so light that you could clearly see every rope and spar and every person. And oh, how handsome the young prince looked as he pressed people's hands and laughed and smiled while the music resounded through the lovely night. It grew late, but the little mermaid could not take her eyes from the ship, and the handsome prince. The many-colored lanterns were put out, no more rockets rose into the air, and no more salutes were fired. But from deep down in the sea there came a murmuring and a roaring. Still she sat upon the water, rocking up and down with it so that she could look into the cabin. But now the ship took a swifter course, one sail higher, and there came lightning from far away. One sail after another was taken in, the billows rolled higher, and there came lightning from far away. A frightful storm was coming on. That was why the sailors reefed the sails. The huge ship pitched to and fro as it flew across the raging ocean. The water rose like great black mountains, but the ship dived like a swan between the billows, and then rose again on their towering tops. The little mermaid thought this grand sport, but not so the sailors. The ship strained and cracked, the thick planks bent under the repeated shocks of the sea. The mast snapped in the middle, and the ship tipped over on her side while the water rushed into the hold. And now the little mermaid saw that they were in danger. For a moment it was so pitch dark that she could see nothing at all, but when a flash of lightning came in, it was bright enough for her to see everything on the ship. People were being tossed helplessly about. She looked especially for the young prince, and as the ship went to pieces, saw him sink into the sea. She was quite pleased, for now he would come down to her. But then she remembered that people cannot live under the water, and that he would be dead by the time he reached her father's palace. Die he must not. Oh no! So she swam among the spars and planks which drifted in on the sea, quite forgetting that they might crush her. Then she ducked beneath the water, and rising again on the billows, managed at last to reach the young prince, who by now was scarcely able to swim any longer on the raging sea. His arms and legs began to fail him. His beautiful eyes were closed. He must surely have died if the little mermaid had not come to his help, holding his head above the water as the billows broke over them. When morning dawned, the storm passed, but not a fragment of the ship was to be seen. The sun rose red and beaming from the water. The prince's cheeks regained the color of life, but his eyes were closed. The mermaid kissed his forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He looked just like the marble statue down in her little garden. She kissed him again and wished that he might live. And now she saw in front of her the mainland, with high blue mountains, on the tops of which the snow shone as though great flocks of white swans lay there. Near the shore were lovely green forests, and in front stood a church. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and in the front of the gate stood tall palm trees. The sea formed a little creek here, quite calm but very deep, right up to the cliff where the sea had washed up the fine white sand. Here she swam with the prince and laid him out on the sand, taking a great care that his head should lie higher than his body in the warm sunshine. And now the bells in the large white building started ringing, and a number of girls came walking through the garden. The little mermaid swam further out behind some lofty rocks which rose out of the water, covering her hair and breast with sea foam so that no one could see her face. There she watched to see who would come to the poor prince. It was not long before a young girl came that way. She was quite frightened when she saw him, but only for a moment. Then she brought a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again, and smiled on those around him. Excuse me. But he did not send a smile to her, for, of course, he did not know that she had saved him. She felt so grieved that when he was carried away into the large building, she dived down under the water, full of sorrow, and sought her father's palace. She had always been silent and thoughtful, but after this she became still more so. Her sisters asked what she had seen when she went above for the first time, but she would tell them nothing. Many a morning and many an evening she rose to the spot where she had last seen the prince. She saw how the fruits of the garden ripened and were plucked. She saw how the snow melted on the lofty mountains, but the prince she did not see, and every time she returned home more and more sorrowful. The only time she was happy was when she sat in her little garden and flung her arms around the pretty marble statue which was so like the prince. But she did not attend to her flowers at all. They grew as if they were wild right over the paths and wreathed their long stalks and leaves among the branches of the trees till it was quite gloomy under their shade. At last she told her story to one of her sisters, and so all the others learned of it. And then it reached the ears of two other mermaids, who told it to nobody but their closest friends. One of these happened to know who the prince was and all about him. She also had seen the merrymaking on board the ship and knew where he came from and where his kingdom was. "Come, little sisters," said the other princesses, and with their arms around each other's shoulders they rose in a long row out of the sea in the place where they knew the prince's palace stood. This was built of a light yellow glistening stone with broad marble staircases, one of which reached straight down to the sea. Through the high windows you looked into lovely rooms hung with rich silk curtains and large pictures, so that it was a pleasure to look at them. So now she knew where the prince lived, and many an evening and many a night she rose upon the water. She swam much nearer to the land than any of the others had dared to do. She even went up the narrow canal under the marble balcony, which cast a long shadow across the water. Here she used to sit and look at the young prince, who fancied he was quite alone in the bright moonlight. Many an evening she saw him sail in his splendid boat, with banners waving and music playing. She would peep from among the green rushes, and when the wind played with her long silvery white veil, and people caught sight of it, they took it to be a swan spreading its wings. Many a night, too, when the fishermen were trailing their nets by torchlight, she heard them speaking of the young prince and praising him so highly that she was more than ever glad that she had saved his life when he was drifting on the waves. And she remembered how his head had rested on her breast, and how she had kissed him. But as he knew nothing of this, he could not even dream about her. There was much she would have liked to know, but her sisters were not able to answer her questions. So she asked her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world. "If men do not get drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Don't they die as we do down here in the sea?" "Yes," said the old dame, "they must die, and indeed their life is shorter than ours. We can live to be 300 years old, but at last we become mere foam upon the water, and are not even buried among our dear ones. We have no souls, we never enter upon a new life. We are like the green rushes. If once they be cut down, they cannot grow again. But men have souls which always live, even after the body has been buried in the earth. They rise up through the clear air to the shining stars. Just as we rise out of the sea up to the lands of men, so their souls mount to the beautiful regions which we shall never see." "Why have we not souls?" asked the little mermaid sorrowfully. "I would give all the hundreds of years I may have to live to be a living child among men, but for a single day, so that I might hope to live in the world above the sky." "You must not bother your head about that," said the old grandmother. "We are much better and happier down here." "So, I shall die and float away like foam upon the sea, hear no more the music of the waves, and see no more the pretty flowers to the red sun. Can I then do nothing at all to win a soul?" "There is only one way," said the old grandmother. "If a man grew to love you so dearly that you were more to him than father or mother, if he clung to you with all his heart and soul, and let the priest lay his right hand in yours and promise to be true to you here and always, then his soul would flow over to your body, and you would have a share in the happiness of men. He would have given you a soul, and yet have kept his own. But that can never be. The very thing that is so pretty in the sea here, your fish's tail, they think is hideous on earth, because they know no better. Up there no one must have a couple of awkward things called legs to be thought handsome." Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fish's tail. "Let us be contented," said the old grandmother, "and hop and skip about to our heart's content in the 300 years we have to live. Upon my word, we have a nice long time of it. We'll have a court ball this very evening." It was indeed a happy sight, such as one never sees on earth. The walls and ceiling of the vast dancing hall were of glass, thick but clear. Many hundreds of huge shells, rosy red and grassy green, were hung in rows on each side, full of blue blazing flames, which lit up the whole room and shone right through the walls, so that the sea around was bright for a long distance. Countless fish, small and great, came swimming past the glass walls, the scales of some of them shining purple-red, while others sparkled like gold and silver. Through the great ballroom flowed a broad stream, and on this the mermen and the mermaids danced to their own pretty songs. Such lovely voices are unknown on earth. The little mermaid sang the sweetest of them all, and they clapped their hands with pleasure. For a moment her heart was glad, for she knew that she had the loveliest voice of all creatures on the earth or in the sea. But soon her thoughts turned once more to the world above her. She could not forget either the handsome prince or her sorrow at not having, like him, a soul. So soon she stole from her father's palace with its mirth and melody, and sat sorrowfully in her little garden. Here she heard a bugle sounding down through the water, and she thought, "Now I know he is sailing up above there, he whom I love more than my father or mother, to whom the thoughts of my heart cling, and whose hands I would willingly lay my life's happiness. While my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch. I have always before been afraid of her, but perhaps she may help me." So the little mermaid went right out of her own part of the sea towards a whirlpool behind which the sea witch lived. She had never gone that way before. No flowers nor sea grasses grew there. Only the bare, gray, sandy bottom stretched out toward the whirlpool, where the water, like a rushing mill-stream, eddied round and round, dragging everything it caught into the deep. She had to go right through these to get to the sea witch's home. Beyond them stood her house in the midst of a most strange wood. All the trees and bushes were half animal, half vegetable. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the ground. All their branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like supple snakes, and they were twisting and twirling from the roots through every joint to the outermost tips of their branches. Everything in the sea which they could catch hold of, they wound themselves about and never let go of again. The little mermaid was quite frightened and stood there, her heart thumping for fear. She was very near turning back, but then she thought of the prince and of the human soul, and her courage came back. She bound her long flowing hair close to her head so that the polypi might not seize it. And then she crossed both hands over her breasts, darted through the water as only fishes can, right between the hideous polypi, which stretched out their long, supple arms and fingers after her. And now she came to a large, slimy, open swamp, where sat the hateful sea witch among slimy water snakes and the bones of shipwrecked men. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "You're a fool for your pains. Still, you shall have your own way, but you will get into trouble, my pretty princess. You want to be rid of your fish's tail, eh? And to have a couple of stumps to walk about on as men have, so that the young prince may fall in love with you, and you may get him and a soul in the bargain." And with that the witch laughed loudly and horribly. "I will brew you a magic drink, and you must swim to land, sit on shore, and drink it before sunrise. Then your tail will split and shrivel up into what men call nice legs, but it will hurt, mind you, for it will be like a sharp sword piercing you. All who see you will say that you are the loveliest girl they ever saw. You will keep your graceful motion. No dancing girl will be able to move so lightly as you, but every step you take for a time will be to you like treading on sharp knives till the blood flows. If you still choose to suffer all this, I have the power to help you." "I do," said the little mermaid, with a trembling voice. She thought of the prince and of winning a soul. "But remember," said the sea witch, "once you have a girl's form, you can never become a mermaid again. You will never be able to dive down through the water to your sisters, or go back to your father's palace. And if you should fail to win the prince's love so that for your sake he forgets father and mother and cleaves to you with all his soul and lets the priest make you man and wife, you will not obtain a soul. If he marries another, your heart will break and you will become mere foam upon the billows." "Be it so," said the little mermaid, but she was as pale as death. "But you must pay me too," said the witch, "and it will be no small thing either that I ask. You have the loveliest voice of all things here at the bottom of the sea, and you fancy you will enchant him with that. I know. Not at all, for you must give that voice to me. I choose to have the best thing you have." "But if you take my voice," asked the little mermaid, what have I left?" "Your lovely form," said the witch, "your light step, and your speaking eyes. You can reach a man's heart with them, I suppose. Well, have you lost courage, eh? Put out your little tongue, and I will cut it off, and you shall have the precious drink." "Be it so, then," said the little mermaid, and the witch put her kettle on the fire to brew the magic drink. At last, when the drink was ready, it looked like the clearest water. "Here you are," said the witch, and cut out the tongue of the little mermaid, so that she could neither sing nor talk. Then the little mermaid swam to her father's palace. The lights in the long dancing hall had been put out. All within were doubtless asleep, but she dared not visit them now that she was dumb and was about to go away from them forever. Her heart felt as if it must burst for sorrow. She stole into the garden, plucked a flower from each of her sisters' flower beds, threw 1,000 kisses towards her home, and swam up again through the dark blue waters. The sun had not yet risen when she saw the prince's palace and mounted and the splendid marble staircase. The moon was shining bright and beautiful. The little mermaid drank the sharp burning potion, and it was as though a two-edged sword pierced through her body. She moaned with agony and lay there as one dead. When the sun rose over the sea, she woke and felt a sharp pang. In front of her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his eyes upon her so intently that she cast her own eyes down and saw that her fishtail had gone, and that she had the prettiest little white legs, but she was quite naked. So she wrapped herself in her long, thick hair. The prince asked who she was and how she had come thither, but she could only look at him with her dark blue eyes, mildly and sadly, for she could not speak. Then he took her by the hand and led her into the palace. Every step she took was as the witch said it would be, as if she were treading on points of needles or sharp knives. But she willingly bore the pain, and holding the prince's hand, mounted the staircase as light as a bubble, so that he and everyone else were as amazed at her light and graceful movements. She was now dressed in the most costly clothing, all silk and muslin. None in the whole palace was so lovely, but she could neither sing nor speak. Lovely slave girls, clad in silk and gold, came and sang to the prince and his royal parents. One of them sang more sweetly than the rest, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This troubled the little mermaid. She knew that she herself had sung far more sweetly, and she thought, "Oh, that he might know that for the sake of being near him I have given away my voice forever." Then the slave girls danced some light and graceful measures to the loveliest music. At this, the little mermaid lifted her white arms, raised herself on the tips of her toes, and floated lightly across the floor as none had ever done before. Everybody was enchanted with her, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. And she danced more and more, though every time her feet touched the floor it was as if she trod on a sharp knife. The prince said that she should always be with him, and she was given leave to sit outside his door on a velvet cushion. At night, in the prince's palace, while others slept, she would go out on the broad marble steps, for it cooled her burning feet to stand in the cold sea water, and then she thought of the friends she had left in the depths below. One night her sisters rose arm in arm, singing sorrowfully as they swam in the water. She nodded to them, and they knew her, and told her how unhappy she had made them all by going away. But every day she became dearer to the prince. He loved her as one might love a dear, good child, but to make her his queen never entered his mind. Yet his wife she must become, or else she could never obtain a soul. "Do you love me most of all?" the eyes of the little mermaid seemed to ask when he took her in his arms and kissed her fair brow. "Yes, you are dearest of all to me," said the prince, "for you have the best heart. You are just like a lovely girl I once saw, but shall never see again. I was on a ship which was wrecked. The billows cast me ashore near a holy temple, where many young girls were worshipping. The youngest, who found me on the seashore and saved my life, I only saw twice. She is the only one I could love in this world, but you are like her. You almost drive her image from my mind. She belongs to the temple, but my good fortune has sent you to me instead, and we will never part." "Alas, he knows not that it was I who saved his life," thought the little mermaid. "I carried him right over the sea to the wood where the holy temple stands. I sat beneath the foam and looked to see if anyone would come. I saw the pretty girl whom he loves better than he does me." And the mermaid drew a deep sigh. But now came talk that the prince was to marry the lovely daughter of the neighboring king, and that was why he now set about fitting out a splendid ship. "I must travel," he said to the little mermaid. "I must see this beautiful princess. My parents ask it of me, but they shall not force me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She is not like the lovely girl in the temple, whom you are like." In the moonlight-lit nights, when all on board were asleep, save the pilot at the helm, she sat at the side of the ship and looked down through the clear water and seemed to see her father's palace. High above it stood the old grandmother with her silver crown on her head, staring up at the ship's keel through the restless water. Then her sisters came up to the surface and looked sadly at her, wringing their white hands. The next morning the ship sailed into the port of the neighboring king's splendid capital. The church's bells were ringing, trumpets sounded from the tops of the high towers, and soldiers stood in line with waving banners and flashing spears. But the princess was not there yet, for she had been brought up in a temple far away, they said, where she had learned to be good and wise. Full of eagerness, the little mermaid waited to see her, and she was sure, when the little princess finally came, that a more beautiful face she had never seen. The prince was enchanted. "It is you!" he cried, embracing the princess. "You who saved me when I lay almost dead on the seashore. I am very happy," he said to the little mermaid. "The very best I dared to hope has come to pass. You too will be glad at my good fortune, for you love me." And the little mermaid kissed his hand, but she felt already that her heart would break. That evening after the wedding, the bride and bridegroom went aboard the ship. Cannons roared and flags waved, and on the deck was placed a royal bridal tent of cloth of gold and purple and precious furs. The sails swelled out in the breeze, and the ship glided lightly over the ocean. When it grew dark, colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of the first time she had risen above the sea, and seen the same gaiety and splendor. She whirled round and round in the dance, skimming along as the swallow skims when it is pursued, and everyone cheered her, for never before had she danced so beautifully. She knew this was the last evening she would ever be able to see him for whom she had left family and home, given up her lovely voice, and suffered endless pain day by day, without his having ever dreamed of it. It was the last night on which she was to breathe the same air as he, to look upon the deep sea and the starlit sky. When it grew dark and all was still on board, the little mermaid leaned her white arms on the railing and looked toward the east for the rosy dawn. At the first sunbeam, she knew well she must die. And now, the sun rose out of the sea. Its rays fell with gentle warmth upon the cold sea foam, and the little mermaid did not feel the pangs of death. She saw above her hundreds of beautiful shapes were hovering, and heavenly music was sounding all about. The little mermaid saw that she now had a body like those about her, and it rose higher and higher from out of the foam. "To whom have I come?" cried she, and her voice sounded like the voices of the other beings, so lovely that no earthly music could equal it. "To the daughters of the air," they answered. "We have found our way to endless life through good deeds. We heal and refresh the children of men. When for 300 years we have done all the good in our power, we have souls. You, poor little mermaid, have tried to be good with your whole heart. Like us, you have suffered and endured, and raised yourself into a spirit of the air. You too can win for yourself a soul after 300 years of good deeds." And the little mermaid raised her bright arms toward the sun, and for the first time felt tears in her eyes. There were life and bustle on board the ship again. She saw the prince and his beautiful bride looking for her, and then sadly down upon the foam, as if they knew she had plunged into the billows. Unseen by either of them, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled upon the prince, and rose with the other children of the air up to the rosy clouds which were sailing the sky. "For 300 years we shall float and float till we glide into God's kingdom." "Yes, and we may get there still sooner," whispered one. "Unseen we entered the houses of men where there are children, and when we find a good child who gladdens his parents' hearts and deserves their love, God shortens our time of trial. The child does not know when we fly through the room, but when we can smile with joy over it, a whole year is taken from the 300. But when we see a selfish or dishonest child, we shed tears of sorrow, and every tear adds a day to our time of trial." The end. That was The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Illustrated by Frederick Richardson and read by Levesque. Thank you.